Our world is changing at a rapid pace, and that pace is growing exponentially. If we want to make sure that it remains stable and that it provides for humanity, we need to start including the people that are, one, a part of that change, but two, have a vested interest in the future that it creates. Two things that we'll prove to you today on side proposition. Firstly, that we improve the parliamentary structure in terms of representation and how that affects policy decisions. But secondly, that this is a legitimate mechanism to implement in achieving that aim. Three arguments we'll give you. First, we'll tell you why reserving seats is a legitimate mechanism to use when we ought to do that. And secondly, why we ought to use it to include more young people into the parliamentary structure. Our second speaker will be talking about youth engagement and how we better that and why that is so necessary for our board. What exactly is our model? It's reserving seats for people under 30 proportional to the demographics of people under 30 in society. Our focus in today's debate is on how young people have been arbitrarily excluded from the parliamentary structure and how this is directly affecting the kind of policy decision that we're making. How is this different from the status quo? Because note that parties don't necessarily have to reflect their voter base in who they elect to seats in parliament, right? We think young voter apathy is quite high anyway. There's a high burden of opposition to prove to us how they get young people into these parliamentary structures without our mechanism. Moving then onto is reserving seats a legitimate mechanism in and of itself. And here we need to ask ourselves, what exactly is the aim of Parliament? It's to represent people in passing legitimate policies and laws and legislations and making decisions on whether those kinds of things are in the interests of the people. Note that the best mechanism here is not necessarily giving control to people who have the most experience or the most learning. We refute this kind of idea that if you put the control of the entire economy into the hands of a couple of economists, that they'd be able to perfectly predict and implement policy to be good for that economy, right? We think the best way to deal with a complex system is to get inputs from all the actors within that system. Now note, we're not advocating for direct democracy. All we're saying is that that's the ideal structure that we ought to try and strive for. We think the parliamentary structure is thus one that approximates that kind of representation, because you elect leaders in order to represent you. We think the problem is that there's a bias working against young people in the system that's excluding them from that kind of representation. And note that if they tell us we're discriminatory towards the old by implementing these kinds of quotas, they need to know that we have discrimination in Parliament all the time, most implicit in terms of the kinds of narratives that qualify you as a good representative, but we also have very explicit kinds of discrimination in a lot of contexts, right? Things like gender quotas in Parliament are common in many places around the world because of the value that we have in realizing that sometimes representation isn't an organic mechanism that can be achieved. We need to implement it through these kinds of quotas. The conclusion here is that we've set up a clear criteria for when we ought to try and reserve seats, and that is a legitimate mechanism, right? Firstly, we think that when there are forces working against certain people being represented in Parliament, and secondly, when that representation is necessary for making good policy decisions and necessary in and of itself. So why ought we reserve these seats then? We told you two things here. We told you that there are forces working against young people, getting them included into these representation structures, right? Because there's this narrative in parliaments currently that experience equals good politicians. And note that this is just fundamentally not true, right? Your experience in the political spectrum doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be a good politician once you've accumulated that experience. Because one, the kinds of issues that you're facing are changing all the day, or all the time. You think what was relevant 50 years ago isn't necessarily relevant today. But we think furthermore that that experience puts in a lot of other arbitrary factors. Things like how many people you know in your party, how many connections you have to other good politicians. And we think that there's simply this bias towards how young you are as a politician. If you look at politicians like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and you look at politicians like Mayor Pete Buttigieg, they are getting criticized in the American parliamentary structure simply because they are too young. The old people are saying that they shouldn't even give credit to their arguments because they are too young and they are too radical. That is an ad hominem. They are not attacking their actual policies that they are putting forth. Thus, we can say that there's legitimate forces within party structures and within parliament that are trying to exclude getting people into those seats. Why then is it so necessary that we work against those kinds of implicit biases to include people into that structure? Before that, I'll take the point.
What are the explicit issues that are not being dealt with at the moment?
Yeah, so this is getting exactly into my point, right? Why do we need this representation? Because we're not getting representation on important issues, right? We think firstly they need to be challenging the old ideas and old kind of loyalisms to absolute ideologies that currently exist in parliamentary structures, right? Things like socialism is always bad. Things like we ought to be careful in how much rights we give to minorities, right? Those are very legitimate narratives that run simply because they come from old contexts and there's still old people dedicated to those contexts. We think we need more young people simply to challenge the kinds of implicit biases that older politicians carry. But secondly, and this is possibly the most important part of our case, is that we need to be implementing young people to create a better future. Because fully relying on the old to deal with the issues that we are currently faced with and how we impact and how that impacts our future is disastrous. Two kinds of examples here. Firstly, on climate change, right? We think these people, old people, aren't adapt to deal with climate change. One of the greatest issues facing humanity, literally our survival as the human race is in question with this issue. Old people aren't adapt, and we can't fully rely on them in the parliamentary structure to deal with this, because they feel like this has been talked about for so long, right? People have been bringing up, caring about the environment since the 1960s. We had the CFCs, all those kinds of things. Old people feel like, oh, climate change is just another issue we don't really need to talk about. They don't realize the urgency of the situation. But secondly, they don't have a vested interest in creating a better future, because quite frankly, they'll be dead before that future ever arrives. Simply putting younger people in parliamentary seats is creating that kind of representation for those issues, because they are involved in that future policy decisions. They're busy creating the world that they are one day going to live in. But secondly, on another kind of example here, challenging big tech firms, something which is really important in terms of controlling how our privacy is respected. The problem here is that old people simply just don't understand how technology works. I don't know if you saw Mark Zuckerberg standing before the House of Representatives, but that was funny on the one hand, but secondly, quite shocking. You have senators trying to make weird analogies about this internet being a system of tubes, and they really don't understand the kinds of technology and processes behind these things that we need to be interrogating very clearly. We can't have people interrogating big tech companies and passing policies on how to regulate those tech companies when they don't know where the on and off button on their computer is. The conclusion here is that we're not saying that old people ought to be excluded from the political spectrum entirely. They ought not be excluded from parliament entirely. All we're saying is that we need more young people in that structure to reflect their interests properly to how many young people there are in society. That's currently not happening. They need to show us how they achieve it on their side.
Ladies and gentlemen, the goal of this debate shouldn't be how we get the most people or most young people into the parliament. The goal of this debate should actually be how do we represent the opinions and the political beliefs of every single person the best, how we can incorporate the beliefs of young people into our general political scenery the best. And we don't think that the appropriate solution to this is just force young people into the government. We haven't heard enough reasons from Team Proposition on why young people are the only group who are capable of representing youth issues. We don't think that that is the case, and because they haven't proved that, they're already failing their burden in this debate. What I'm going to do in my speech, two things. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the argument on how they're going to have worse of representation and why identity politics isn't the universally best case. But secondly, also how the political scenery is going to be worse and how they're actually going to get less politics catered to the youth. But before that, I'll have a few points of refutation. We think that the proposition's burden in this debate is to prove that the young people are the only capable candidates who can actually cater to the ideas of young people. Our problem with their argument that we need to invest in the future is three things. Firstly, if the youth cared the most about only young issues, and if the young people thought that the only people capable of representing them were young people, then they would already go and elect all of those young people. We haven't heard any kind of a characterization from Proposition's team that young candidates don't exist. We already don't think that's true. We already see a positive trend that they agreed to. For example, that AOC is already in the government. We don't think that it's true that people cannot elect young candidates. They do have the possibility. And if it were true that young people only cared for young politicians, then they would already vote for this. But secondly, if it were true that young people only care for youth politics or whatever they want to characterize, which we really don't understand, then older politicians would cater to them too. The problem of Proposition is that they don't take into account the incentives of politicians. We say that the incentive of politicians is to get elected into the government. If they know that the thing that young people care about most is climate change, then they would do those policies. And we already have examples on our side. For example, Bernie Sanders is super socialist and super liberal, or something that they want to characterize the youth as. Elizabeth Warren is already actively, for example, campaigning about college loan overhaul. We think that those are the policies that young people care about, and it isn't true that older politicians don't want to do. But thirdly, the problem is that the uniquely youth or future policies, they just simply aren't unique to the future. They simply aren't unique to the youth. Adults also need to care about environmental change. Adults also want to care about college loans. Why? Because, I don't know, their kids and their kids' future, their grandchildren also depend on it. So it isn't simply true that older people don't care about those issues. And no, thank you, there somehow exist problems that older people cannot happen or cannot do something. We don't think that disenfranchised youth is a problem on our side. Politicians are already catering to them. Maybe their political apathy is true, so thank you. And we don't think that it's contingent on a lack of young candidates who are still voting and if there aren't enough women in our parliament. But now moving on to my own arguments. Firstly, why we don't vote for identity. We think that people vote on very many different issues. For example, you vote based on policy. You vote for a person who's the best representative of, I don't know, having progressive tax, or who can who talks about free trade the most or the best, or who is the best economist. We think that's a very legitimate choice. Secondly, people vote based on competency. For example, who is the person who's most likely going to be the most successful politician, who's going to get the policy through the most. Maybe you care less about the policy, but you just want them to be like a person who is successful, or thank you, or because of other things. And thirdly, there are probably people who vote based on identity, where it be like women or young people, but we already think that it's a minority. Prop needs a significant percentage of young people in the government in order to have some kind of a change on their side. This means that they always need to prioritize young candidates over some other candidates that were voted for. But we see that right now, enough young candidates what they say is that not enough young candidates are in the parliament right now, which means that people don't want to vote for young candidates. This means that people don't think that they are the most accurate representation for them because maybe they don't care about the right issues. No, thank you. So we think what is going to happen is in the government there are going to be people who aren't actually representatives of what my views are. And we think that this is also true for young people, because young people right now maybe aren't voting for young people. Maybe I want to vote for Bernie Sanders, and that is the candidate that is going to get less votes on their side. No, thank you. So we think that Prop is trying to give some additional representation to some kind of an imaginary group at the expense of other people. But furthermore, if young people are the ones who aren't voting right now, it means that they don't care about politics, and they don't care enough that the issues actually matter to them. The people who have gone out and voted for someone, no thank you, are the ones who felt that the political climate is something that affects them to such a great extent that they need to go out and vote. But these are the ones that they are going to alienate on our side. These are the ones who they're going to take representation away from, because their candidates are much more likely to not get into the parliament. So the ones who actually went out and vote, their votes are cared about the least, and we think that they're going to get less fair political representation. And we think that it's inherently bad if they want to have political representation. But before moving on to my second argument, go.
Do you support the increasing rates
that is to an extent a different issue. If it were true that young people are being voted to be like older politicians can cater to them, like I already told you about. Maybe it is a different issue that maybe they just don't care about politics. We think that is also fine. Maybe voter apathy is also a legitimate choice and people don't go to vote because they don't support the politics. We think all of those things are fine and a different issue. But we will talk about that also later in our speeches. Moving to my second argument that we are going to have worse politics on our side. But then with the defense that we're going to have more youth politics or some ideas that are exclusive to the youth, we just still haven't understood what the things really are that they want to talk about. We think that climate change should actually be cared for by everyone. We don't think that is an exclusive youth idea. But let's take their best case. Let's take the case that young politicians are going to get into those governments through mandates. And we think what the case is most likely is they are the people who have gotten the most votes. They're the people who have gotten theirs only thanks to mandates, because not enough people are voting for young people right now, so they wouldn't also go and vote for young people under them, or at least we haven't heard any kind of a mechanism on why that would be the case. So there are going to be people without mandates in the government because you just need to fill some kind of quota. What this means, they already tell in their speeches, no thank you, that there exists this narrative that young politicians are incompetent, they're young, they're stupid, somehow all of those things. What is going to happen on their side is that this is only going to be exacerbated. When you get into the government, you're already told that you're young and stupid, but now you're also going to be told that you have no mandate to be there because you just got here based on a quota. This means that there are going to be even bigger stereotypes based on those young people because they don't want to be listened to. Because now those older people have an actual reasoning why those young people shouldn't be listened to. And the impact of this is that less youth issues are actually going to be talked about because people just don't feel like they can also belong. You feel like a role filler, you cannot prove yourself in the government, and this is harmful for yourself. This means that already the politicians, the young politicians, AOC, can also have more legitimacy in the government just because the older people are going to say that we all have no legitimacy. The only reason why you're here is because of a quota. So we think that the youth politics they want to do is inherently going to be less talked about. But furthermore, we don't think that we should ever limit the issues of a minority to that minority because this means less political capital. What they are doing is that the issues of young people get exclusively talked about by young people because somehow they're the only ones who have the qualifications, but we don't think that they're youth issues. The parties will never promote those younger people if they know that they're already going to get in by definition due to quotas. They're always going to prioritize other groups of people. So even if we talk about in debates, for example, in public debates, then young people aren't going to be put there because they're going to get in anyways. Older candidates will be put there. And we think that in those cases, those youth issues, if they're in this case, are never going to be talked about. We prefer Elizabeth Warren talking about youth issues, and we prefer every single person getting equal representation. For all of those reasons, vote Team Estonia.
The yellow vests in France have turned to radicalism and violence to force their agenda of climate change, conflating it with anti-Semitism and violence against not just policy but the state itself. That happened despite their president being one of the youngest politicians at the moment. Importantly, we have to understand the current status quo and why youth engagement is so fundamentally poor and how we overcome it. Before I answer the main question of this debate on how we achieve the aims of parliamentary democracy, let's talk about the strategy of this debate thus far. Our burden here was to show you a unique and inherent harm, something that we do very clearly when we say that what we want to fix in the debate is the unfair and arbitrary monopolization that they all have within these parliaments, right? Not necessarily the policies that they're making as the primary thing, but the fact that they have that monopoly is the harm that we want to overcome. The reason this is strategically important is because most of their claims, which are counter proposals on, but old people can care as well, don't deal with what we're trying to fix. They don't deal with that monopoly. They just sort of say, oh, but they can care as well. That's simply insufficient. But second, because of that bias existing, there is a legitimate intervention that needs to take place void of that outcome so that we can get those young people into that parliament. And finally then, under strategy, it's important to realize that we're not saying these old people can't do anything, we're not saying we're going to get rid of them, we're saying we want proportionality to the population so that there's a balance of possibility, a balance of policy, something that they also kind of want when they say that some old people do care. But now, let's do a little bit of cleanup, because it's getting quite messy under their side. Let's be very clear on how parliamentary democracies work, because they seem to be saying that young people can elect young people into office, and the fact that there are no young people in office somehow means that the young people don't care. Yeah, no, that's not how it works at all. Parliamentary democracies, people vote for their parties, not their candidates. What that means is that there's a massive lack of transparency when they try to put people in parliament, because their seats are chosen by those parliamentary members in the absence of a quota system. That means that young people might be voting for Labour, but they're not putting in young people in those seats, and subsequently their debates don't exist. That's harmful to their side, because this weird reasoning that, oh, young people must just not care, simply does nothing in the debate. They definitely care, they're just not getting those issues heard about. Because there are unique policies and unique things to the youth that some people just don't understand. The desire for university education, for example, the changing narratives about climate change, and those sort of things that they do understand. But given the strategy, it's monumentally important that we realize that they're not engaging in core debate. They're just sort of offering these strange shifts on how old people care too, which does absolutely nothing to that main harm. First question that I'm going to answer: how do we fulfill the aims of parliamentary democracy? This is the most important clash of the debate, and it's one that you have to care about, because it's that illegitimate monopoly that we're trying to overcome, primarily. We say that there is an unfair monopoly because 1, there are biases, 2, people are stubborn to relinquish their power, 3, people use the term experience to mask the fact that they're using their old established connections to entrench their own power. The conclusion here is that that monopoly desperately needs to be overcome. What do they say? Oh, they say that their incentive is to win an election. Important. 1, none of their examples are true to what we're talking about. AOC and Bernie Sanders exist in a presidential system where they run individually. 2, parties may push this idea that they are appealing to their voters, but then do absolutely nothing on it. Look, when it came to Brexit, every Tory member of Parliament was present. When it came to passing a law about mental health in schools, 6 were present. Right? They can easily say that they're going to do policy, but because there's this monopoly of the age, only the age priorities take place. The second thing we say is that there's an urgent necessity because these things are reflecting in policy changes. Some old people do care, and that's perfectly fine and it's perfectly valid. But at the point where the majority are prioritizing other things, certain policies like climate change, like welfare, like caring about minorities are just going to be outed because of the predominant narratives. And those minority of the old people are even outed because of those old beliefs permeating. The main thing that they give us under this clash, to try and counter-offer against our principle here, is that policy voting, it needs to be policy voting and the youth aren't voting. Yeah, this was quite confusing. So they said, you always need to prioritize a candidate that will represent you, and you also should be voting, they say that we should be prioritized, that we're over-prioritizing the youth, because the youth currently aren't voting and there's unfair representation. Importantly here, we must understand that the youth do care. Right? It's the voter apathy is occurring not because they don't care about their policies, but because they are not getting any form of representation whatsoever. That's where they start turning to other alternatives that I'll be talking about in my speech. That's where they start turning to abandoning that system. We actually allow for the representation that they want. For them to say that just because young people aren't voting, which they're trying to do, does not mean that we shouldn't be creating change for those young people. Does not mean that the monopoly is illegitimate. Final question here is on the idea of effects. They seem to give you this idea that we're going to exacerbate costs. They say that there's no mandate to care for the young issues. Look, parties do have some incentive to try and gain elections, and if there are young members of parliament that they can put in seats, these will increase their popularity if those issues are voted upon. They're not just necessarily going to crack down on these people. And if they crack down on these people, 1, that doesn't mean we should just allow their monopoly to exist because we're afraid of them. But 2, they often call out this cracking down, like 9 Labour MPs that said there's structural anti-Semitism and youth aggression within the Labour Party. Before I move on to showing how we get best youth engagement, I'll take you.
If these politicians are so adherent to these old values and they would still choose the young people that represent them in Parliament, why wouldn't they choose the young candidate whose views align with their own the most?
Look, it's going to align ever so slightly such that there won't be violent populists that hate their parties. But it's important to realize that young people have to try and be different if they're to infiltrate this massive structure. That means that I can represent myself as a Tory, but still be very libertarian when I suddenly get my seat. Right? There's a slight difference there. Don't think that that's a contradiction, because people can be representative of their parties while still calling their parties out. We can't debate on absolutes. How do we get better youth engagement? Let's be clear, this is a generation that definitely cares about passing policy. But the problem is, at the point where none of that is represented, you get to turn them to radicalism and you turn them to violence, like the example of the yellow vests in France. Even on the best end of the spectrum, where people are engaging in parallel engagement like Black Lives Matter, they're not voting because they don't get any sort of benefit from that voting. We want to move people away from this radicalism, and we want to give them the opportunity to have a beneficial democratic system in order to get better youth engagement. Why is this important? We give them a new platform when they are capable of actually infiltrating parliamentary democracy. If you can run in an election, and if you are going to be respected in that election, it is much less likely that you turn to violence and populism. Because people only empower populists at the point where they are isolated from a political system, and it seems valid in taking that political system down. When we say that actually your demographic is cared about, and actually we will empower people that represent you, these people don't need to be that violent anymore. That's a long-term benefit that we managed to achieve. For example, in Armenia, Serge Sargsyan was a politician that represented a youth populist movement, actually calling for a coup at some point. The president solved this very simply by putting him in parliament and giving his party seats in parliament. Nowadays, they're very quick-natured and they're very calm because they don't need to criticize the system once they're inside the system. That means that the youth are no longer so vicious and so aggressive that they functionally undermine the democratic system. The conclusion of this argument is that the violent politics of the youth and the apathy of the youth is placated at the point where they have better opportunities. Let's not let people choose a future that they won't be involved in.
Now welcome the second speaker from side opposition.
The argument that second speaker makes about the yellow vest movement and other movements disappearing is not an argument exclusive under their side because it isn't exclusive to young people. Many people are often angry at the political system and feel like their voices aren't amplified enough. This isn't true only for young people, and therefore I don't understand why this point is exclusive in this debate. Many people feel that like they want more representation, and the youth isn't the only one who has these notions. Therefore, they will need to prove why everyone should be represented to the level of which they exist in society, in Parliament, but this always isn't true at the moment. You don't always think that only one group can represent this group's ideas, but rather believe that a politician can have values based on their political beliefs, and you can accustom your identity to form to those political beliefs that you hold. That your identity is part of who you are as a human, what you want from society, something that you vote for a politician on. They need to prove identity as an important place in the political system. In this speech, firstly, I'm going to answer 3 questions in rebuttal. Firstly, looking whether there is a problem in the status quo. Secondly, looking at how they are actually going to distort the political system. And thirdly, on why, under their side, young people are especially going to be worse off. And then finally, moving to my extension about why identity politics are especially harmful and why this isn't a narrative or a standard that we should prove. something that our proposition crucially wants. Firstly, let's look at whether there is actually a problem. Because what they've been telling us constantly is that young people have different shifts and none of these, different ideologies and none of these things are currently being appealed to. They never actually show to us why all young people think in the same way, which is kind of crucial for their analysis to stand. Because they try to explain that all old people think similarly and young people have a completely different view of those things. I don't think this is true. Most people in this room probably have to some level different points of view or perspectives, even though we are all probably under the age of 30, and therefore also, which also obviously exemplifies the fact that we can't simply make broad assumptions on what the youngest people might want. Therefore, it's necessary to have as much nuance as possible, and even if it's true under that side that they want some kind of political change, and they can always get it under our side as well, as they've never been able to show you why being young is important for that young person to vote for someone, rather than vote with them or vote on the political beliefs. But moreover, in issues they say that appeal more to you, I think that these are all issues that are already being accounted for. They don't never tell us why this higher voting rates would stem from under their side. If we already have politicians dealing with minority rights, or dealing with climate change, or dealing with problems of big tech. Those are the three examples that they bring out in their first speech. But these are obviously things that at least some politicians are dealing with. Therefore, they never show an explicit need for young people to be in political systems if all of their main impacts are already being dealt with. But finally, representation isn't simply visual of you seeing that I am a young person and there is a young person accounting for me, but rather that young people also want some kind of level of political representation, meaning that this person is doing things that are better for me. We think that this level of representation already exists due to the mechanisms that we've explained. The young people can choose people who are going to make their lives better, and the young people's problems, which they say are all the same, are currently being accounted for. Therefore, they never make the argument where you need to see a young person, but this is the argument they would have to make under that characterization to have been able to prove to you that otherwise a problem doesn't exist and young people can get representation. But secondly, let's look at the general electoral system. They tell us we are wrong because we are only talking parliamentary elections and we are only voting for a party. This isn't true. Everywhere you still vote for a candidate of that party and still want to align yourself with that certain candidate because their ideas shift somewhat from the general consensus of that party. Each candidate is individual, and that's the reason why we are even having this discussion. AOC isn't the democratic movement, but it's part of the democratic movement, and it's necessary for people to be able to vote on a certain candidate. We think that people are still voting for candidates, and their argument isn't like that doesn't have much impact. But moreover, even if it is true that only these parties are making decisions, then it's still problematic on their side because older people would obviously still choose a candidate that aligns with their views. The Republican Party would never put an environmentalist as their front-runner young politician because this simply doesn't align with their views, and therefore none of their impacts would still be true. If it is so that parties choose these things, and if it is true that these parties are ageist, as they tell you, then none of their impacts would going to exist in this debate. What is the hard and big that's under our side they fail to respond to is that other people are using representation on the account of us trying to artificially increase representation of young people. They need to respond to this harm and say why it's justified for someone's vote to matter less simply because of the fact that they didn't vote for someone who was under 30 years old. If we're artificially putting more of young people into parliaments, then obviously if someone is voting, then obviously some votes are going to go simply to waste because of the fact that they have been given to another candidate, and therefore these votes matter less. But even if voters based on identity, as they want to tell you, then they wouldn't get those benefits because of the systems that they themselves describe as being structurally against young people, which still continue to exist under their side. Secondly, they don't really rebut our second argument about how this is going to be worse for young people, even if they have these general issues. We tell you how these stereotypes persist to exist under their side, specifically for the fact that experience still would be the gold standard in these parliaments. These young people would have less of that experience because they would have been artificially put into those voting lists and wouldn't have gathered that place themselves. Moreover, these young people feel like they haven't got that place themselves and they're more of a role filler for that party to, for example, be able to run in those elections. This is the argument that they don't respond to, but obviously tells how these young people will have even more of a voice in Parliament and how their opinion will matter less. But moreover, they haven't proven to respond to the fact that the parties are not going to give these young people the opportunity to become more popular, that they won't be promoted, and that they won't be in these debates. Therefore, it's better to have Elizabeth Warren as this huge frontrunner for young views, rather than having these politicians who will never have the same political capital. Before I go on,
Your favorite example of AOC got elected by Democratic convention, despite the fact that she was generally against their centrist views. That's because young people who are popular can be empowered even if they're against the party.
Yeah, but I think the Democratic Party is a different example from, for example, the Republican Party, obviously doesn't have any of those same views that you say all young people have. The Democratic Party has those general ideas of minority rights or climate being important, for example. There wasn't as big of a shift as it would be for the Republican Party, which is also the example that you need to protect under your side. My intention about identity politics. Notice that this is side proposition's underlying benefits. That identity forms your political views and that it should be an important factor of how you make your political decisions. Because the way you are as a person should be reflected in the way that you think of politics and the way that you want to see society change. But if there are two reasons why it's bad, if people start counting identity as a reason for making their political decisions. Firstly, this isn't a nuanced view of politics. This is only grants people virtue representation, not factual one, because the sense that you are similar to someone isn't the same as the sense that you are actually being represented. When I give my vote to someone who is simply a man because of the fact that they are a man, I look less into their political views and their political viewpoints, making my choice only based on my identity, but not actually what this person is going to do for me as a man, or how they are going to improve my life quality. This is fundamentally bad for people because they get less real representation under their side of the house if identity is an important factor in making decisions, because they don't care about the political choices of that candidate, but only care about the identity of that person. But moreover, it's difficult to reach decisions in Parliament because if we're only talking about identity problems and identity issues, then one group has to become the most important group in order for these issues to become the most relevant. The youth never will become that most important identity group, and it will rather be one of the majorities that they describe. This is where we are pitting identity groups against each other, and we think that it's less likely that young people will be able to raise their problems to the majority and get backing from that majority to deal with these issues, simply because of the fact that these two identities clash with each other. For all of these reasons, opposed.
About 8 minutes and 17 seconds.
Next speaker for your speech, and you're on third speaker inside the position concluded is Deputy Case.
As side proposition, our burden was simple, and we told it to you right at the beginning of Ket's speech. We told you that representation is the most important thing in a parliamentary democracy. But moreover, we told you that the harm in this debate is a monopoly of all people within parliaments that harm that representation. That was our unique and inherent harm. That was what they had to engage with to win this debate. The fact of the matter is that the only example that they give us of an individual that represents the young voice is Bernie Sanders. We think that their case appeals to this unique and inherent harm. Three strategic flaws that have lost them in this debate. The first is this principal concession. Their first speaker ends their speech on this very emotive example about how democracy is about equal representation, when our model is literally having people in parliament that directly represent the youth demographic of your country. We'd say that we are clearly the side that is better on a principle that they would push themselves. But secondly, the burden on us was not on us to prove that young people are the only ones capable of representing young voices. Our burden was to prove that there is an existing system in place where those young voices are not being represented. When we need to change something, we gave you mechanisms about why this is the best change, but moreover, we wouldn't have it like only young people within parliaments. We have a mixed model that is proportional. We have accountability mechanisms that make sure that the policy that is pushed forward represents everybody. We say in that case, it is more likely that their voices are represented by young people on our side of the house. But moreover, we're not actually sure if they agree with the problem in this debate or not, because they've been kind of messy within their analysis, right? We don't know if they think that the rates of young people voting is an issue. If they think that it isn't an issue, have to do the work to prove that there is a trend of young people's involvement within politics that's actually on the rise. They fail to do that. If they concede that it is an issue, then they have to show a model in which they would change this issue that currently exists. They did neither of those things, no matter what they decide the problem will be in their next speech, because we really don't know what their stance is. We think that they've lost either way. But thirdly then, their case relies on young people not wanting young people to be within Parliament, right? And we'd say that it's fine. If you want to vote for Bernie Sanders, you can still do that on our side of the house because you have a mixed model. But we told you then that we see the need for young people within Parliament because people are simply going to alternate methods to get their voices represented. They're going to civil society, groups like Extinction Rebellion, or turning to civil society leaders like David Hogg. The issue there is that those people don't have an influence on our political spectrums. People ought to be represented. Forcing them to protest to get their voices heard is simply not what parliamentary democracy ought to do. The first question then about representation. Note that this is the most important thing in this debate. They want you to base their model on change. We think it's about the actual number of people representing everybody's voice. For a large part they concede this. What do they tell us here? They tell us that they actually are electing young people, that older people can represent young people too, and actually we're not going to put the correct young people in place, so we should just give up anyway. What did we tell you here? We told you that they intensely mischaracterize youth engagement for 3 reasons. First, we gave you examples about things like places like the British Parliament that are simply monopolized by old white men. But moreover, we actually gave you mechanisms of why that happens. We told you about a narrative of experience. We told you how they target young people's youth to disprove their political capital. We told you about networks that allow those people to stay in those positions. But secondly then, we say that even in their best case, where this imaginary trend that they don't describe to us actually exists, people are shut out at the point at which they are one of the few young people within that spectrum. AOC is unlikely to ever succeed because people prey on her because of her youth. But thirdly then, we'd say that even if that isn't the case, they tell us about presidential elections. Not once do they even mention the name of an MP in their actual case. We'd say that that is important because Parliament literally passes the policy that goes forward. It's not just about campaigns, it's about the actual changes. How do you deal with the climate? And what does your welfare state look like? That's where young people's voices are not being represented. They already lost just in the face of our substantive case. A couple more things there. First, they misalign the issues of these young people. They misalign the incentives of older politicians for 3 reasons. Firstly, we told you that often older politicians build like their political base and capital on older ideas that simply aren't progressive. This looks like Mike Pence building his political career on ideas that simply we don't agree with anymore. And that is why they're unlikely to actually change their stance and suddenly care about the climate. But they have a voter base that votes for them based on the fact that they don't care about issues like that. But secondly, we told you that there is just a discord that is generational. There is a lack of understanding about the issues that young people care about. When politicians simply undermine our issues and call us millennials and tell us that we don't actually have real problems, we say that is the point at which they simply do not understand. But thirdly, we say there is no incentive for them to actually appeal to young people because of the apathy that they concede exists. At the point at which young people aren't voting on their side of the house, but are more likely to vote on ours, we say that we correct the incentive of these political parties. But secondly then, we say that even if there are old people that care about things like climate change, but we concede there are, we'd say that those individuals get shut down because those aren't the issues that are important. The reason that Bernie Sanders failed so horribly is because the entirety of the US political spectrum didn't care about things like a welfare state, didn't care about things like socialism. But thirdly then, we think that they're likely to be the correct type of young people that actually care about issues like climate change because a party has an incentive to put the most popular person within Parliament. They do what's best for them even if there's likely to be some friction between the issues that they actually care about. So we think they're likely to put AOC in Parliament rather than some unknown person that simply doesn't care about these issues. Ultimately, they concede that representation is important. We are the side that creates the most representation. We've won this debate on this clash alone. For that, we're taking.
You say it is legitimate for a young person to vote for an old person, for example, like Bernie Sanders, but what you're doing is you're taking that old person's spot and replacing with a young candidate that didn't receive that young person's vote. You aren't representing the youth.
So our model is mixed, right? But moreover, it's proportional to your society. That means that Bernie Sanders is still going to have a voice, but at the same time, AOC is still going to have a voice. Their model is simply not nuanced. Right? We told you that we don't believe in anybody having a monopoly. We told you that everybody ought to have a voice. That's why it's proportional. That was literally counted within the first 30 seconds of our P1. Second issue then, which they want to base their entire case on, this issue of change. What they tell us here is that young people will have no backing once we put them in parliament because people will dislike them because they're young, they won't talk about the actual issues. Let's take that principle to the logical extent of it. There is backlash against women and minorities in parliament. Would you reject their entrance into parliament as well? We'd say that we ought shape our society with values that we want, not on backlash from Republicans that we simply do not agree with. But secondly then, we gave you analysis about how we change political discussion inherently. Because when there are enough voices that care about things like climate change, that understand things like technology, the discussion in parliament changes. This means that the issues that are put forward are agreed upon by a large group of people instead of the one person that's under 30 sitting there in the status quo. Ultimately, backlash is something that we shouldn't care about, even if it did. Our model counters that inherently. It wasn't our burden to prove that we create effective change, but ultimately we did that too. Side opposition has lost this debate. We told you why representation was important, but moreover, we gave you mechanisms of how the only side you can get it on is our side of the house. Secondly then, we showed you how we value that representation, how we create real change with voices that have been shut out for decades.
The next speaker for this speech, we now welcome the third speaker from opposition to conclude opposition's scheduled text.
Panel, note that proposition in this debate needed to prove that young people couldn't get representation from older people, as this is the justification why we do need gender quotas in our society. The fact that female pluralism issues are not being dealt with, and the only way that we can get that is by increasing the representation of women in Parliament. However, they didn't prove that only young people are the people who can represent youth issues, which means that in this instance, we feel that they needed more, or they needed to do more to prove the problem that we have in society. Because, as we have been stating throughout all of our speeches, we don't really believe that there is such a huge problem, the fact that we do have young people like AOC or older people like Bernie Sanders. Now, the reason why representative democracy is so amazing is that if there was a huge problem, which proposition is characterising the facing young people, then this would obviously electrify the young population and make them vote more to change the status quo. This has already been happening in the United States, no thank you, and in areas where this isn't happening, we think that the problem obviously isn't large enough. Because if people aren't voting, then it means that the issues aren't large enough for them to feel that they need to vote. Three things that I want to talk about in my speech. No thank you. Firstly, I'm going to look at the legitimacy of reserving seats and excluding politicians who otherwise would have got in. Secondly, I'm going to look at how the legitimacy of young people in political discourse would change. And then lastly, I'm going to look at whether there really is a necessity to get young people into Parliament. But first of all, is it legitimate to reserve seats for these people? They say that Parliament has to represent all people in all demographics, or that this is something that this is an ideal that we should be adhering to. So what is important is that we need to compare what sort of group is more important in this debate. Whether the young people who are politically apathetic or the people who voted for representatives that would now be excluded. No, thank you. The reason why we are protecting the more important group is that the people who voted for representatives that would now be excluded, no thank you, obviously had an incentive to vote. They felt that an issue that was important in society needed to be dealt with. Now, when these politicians are excluded, these issues are not going to be dealt with. Their votes are now going to be lost. Their representation is going to be lost. Notice that this is a much greater harm than an intangible harm of monopoly power or something like that. Because obviously, if this was as important as they are trying to characterise, then young people would also be voting for young people if they felt that only in this way we could break this monopoly and these issues would be dealt with. Moving on. Okay, before that.
Citizens don't vote for MPs, parties elect them and put them into power.
Yep.
How are young voters supposed to change the mindset of their party?
I'm going to, in my third point, I'm going to tell you why this analysis is actually extremely destructive to your case. But before that, I want to talk about the legitimacy of young people in political discourse. Because if we acknowledge that there already is some bias, then it is important to analyse under which side this bias is actually greatest. And at least under our side, these young politicians have legitimacy as they have a democratic mandate to actually be present in Parliament. But under their side, these young politicians are delegitimised further by enforcing biases against them. The fact that the only reason they are in Parliament is because of identity politics, not because the population actually wants them there. Which means there's going to be, no thank you, there's going to be less cooperation with other politicians. The fact that other politicians will take problems that they outline into account much less. This increasing stereotype, which was strengthened by our extension, no thank you, will also affect young politicians who would have gotten fairly. The fact that AOC now has a larger burden to prove herself because we have strengthened the stereotype that young politicians are just in Parliament because of some sort of identity politics, no thank you. Which means that even if they prove that youth issues exist and that new politicians will protect them, it is now much harder to prove that these issues are important when these people are in Parliament. The comparative is that it is better to have 2 legitimate politicians calling for debate than 6 that are not listened to and laughed at. This is why we win the legitimacy of having youth issues overall in Parliament, even if they prove the fact that there are these youth issues and that new politicians will protect them. So thank you. Let's move on to a really important question in this debate. Do we actually even need to get young people into Parliament? I have 3 responses. First of all, about the fact that old people are just overall bad at policies, we think that this isn't true. They haven't proven an inherent tie between the problems that they outlined and older populations. For example, when they talk about the fact that old people aren't invested in the future, then we say that, hey, this probably isn't true because on a personal level, many of these politicians have family or children who these policies would still affect. But B, many politicians still protect external interests that aren't connected to them, for example, LGBT rights and the problems of ethnic minorities. So we don't believe that old people could never really look at problems that maybe affect people in the future. But secondly, it is really important to note, as I pointed out in my POI, that if these politicians are so adherent to these old values and they would still choose the young people that represent them in Parliament, as pointed out in the POI before, why wouldn't they choose a candidate whose views align with their own? The sort of politicians they are talking about, or who they are characterising, are like Republican politicians, are like UKIP politicians. No, and in no world would this sort of party choose a person who is socialist or cares about minorities. Now this is incredibly important to note, as increasing the visibility of these issues was their main problem. And because as there exist my young people who aren't socialists, and these are the sort of people that will be used to fill the quota, no thank you, and they don't fix the problem that they outlined in their first speech, and they should lose this debate. No. But then let's also look at the problem, that the fact that they don't really respond to our arguments that large political platforms are not going to focus on these issues, even if they prove that these were youth issues. Because under us, political parties would have an incentive to win over young people. The fact that young people, or the overall group of these youth, are a potential political capital, which means that under us there was always going to be an incentive for these politicians to try and capture these votes. They didn't prove why this incentive doesn't exist under us, or why politicians wouldn't want to talk about youth issues, which means that this is also another reason why we don't think this problem exists. Before I explain no further, I'll take you.
Would 1 or 2 men voting on a women's rights bill eradicate the need for a female quota in Rwandan Parliament?
Well, no. But as I explained, I don't think that this is completely analogous, because I think there are quite structural issues why, for example, male politicians can't really deal with women's issues, or can't really understand the extent to which they're important, and this is why gender quotas are very important. But these aren't that analogous to cases where, as we have analysed through all of our speeches, why youth issues are not so, or are also tangible for politicians who maybe aren't young themselves. But now, moving on about why actually we get more, we can actually deal with this collectively better. Now, we've already proven that there is potential capital, which means that these political parties that we are talking about at the moment want to deal with campaigning and want to fight political apathy to gain the votes of young people. But what is Proposition doing? Proposition is getting rid of this incentive, because parties are now already going to have to fill seats with these young people who, if all of their analysis was true, young people who wanted to fight for young problems, which means that we think that the incentive disappears, because now it doesn't matter whether your young politicians get 10,000 or 80,000 votes, because you're going to be putting them into parliament anyway, which changes the incentive that political parties have. It is now no longer beneficial to put a lot of money into campaigning for young people's votes, because these people are already going to go to parliament anyway, which means we're actually shifting the political platform away from young people. We are shifting it towards groups that are actually in the majority, proving to other groups, to other social groups, that yes, we are actually capturing your votes because we are protecting your interests, and we are going to promise you that we are going to get someone with your interest into parliament. Because for all of these reasons, please vote for Proposition. Thank you.
We thank the speaker for their speech, and the will make the national request to order, and welcome back to the High Speaker, side opposition.
Panel, it is crucial to note that any quota system comes with a trade-off. We are artificially increasing the representation of one group at the expense of other groups. To justify this trade-off, side proposition needed to prove two things. Firstly, that there are inherent problems that only young people face and understand, but secondly, that there are way too few politicians dealing with these problems at the moment. We think that they do neither of those things and therefore fundamentally lose this bet. Firstly, I'm going to do two things in my speech. Firstly, I want to look at the idea of representation and which side actually gets it, and secondly, I want to look at the issue of young politicians and how are they going to be treated on either side of the house. So firstly, let's look at the point that Proposition makes about representation being important. The crucial problem with this argument is that they don't show where representation cannot exist. We've told you that political views can be carried out by older politicians, and that these political views can be the ones that align with the views of young politicians. The three things that they come out with in their first speech are already things that are being dealt with and not being dealt with only by young politicians. The examples of Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren are obvious examples on our side who are doing these things not only because they are young, because they obviously aren't, but are doing these things because they are reasonable in their opinion and think that this is going to make society better. But moreover, we think that their intention when they try to respond to us is there are structural problems why young politicians can never get into the parliament to amplify young voices, because there's tension in their response. They firstly say that these people can never make it through this horrendous system, but then they try to tell us how AOC was able to break through the Democratic Party and was able to fight off all of these things. Obviously, then the structural problems aren't that big enough, and obviously then these politicians can actually exist in the system at the moment. The crucial problem, though, is that they don't prove why there would be more young politicians or more young voters under their side. This is the thing that they had to win in order to win this. Had to prove in order to win the point on representation. They instead are lowering the value of a young person's vote, telling them that if they are voting for anyone else, then their vote is inherently going to matter less because of the fact that we are putting in candidates who are inherently going to get into parliament and not only looking at the results of voting. This is that they are harming the group they want to protect the most, but also are harming every other voter, and we telling to them that your vote is less important because we are trying to fix a problem that they've never proved to us truly exists. But finally, even if there are youth issues, then they don't respond to our own analysis on why it's bad if these youth issues are framed as only youth issues. This is especially true when they never respond to my extension, in which I tell you that it is more difficult to clash identities, which is a very fundamental part of human being, rather than to clash very concrete policies on which you can actually have debates. Therefore, if some issues are only seen as youth issues, then none of these things are going to be picked up by older politicians who still have more capital. Therefore, these youth issues give less representation to young voters. But secondly, let's look at the young politicians who they want to protect. We tell you that these young politicians are going to be shut out even more due to all of the narratives that they themselves say exist. AOC would not be proposing the Green New Deal if every other person in that room had told her that you were the one sitting on that reserved seat, that you never earned that seat, that you still don't have the qualifications, which is still the standard in all of those parliaments that they describe to you. This person who doesn't have that qualification will always be in a worse off position under their side, but will especially be in a worse off position because they themselves are more likely to buy into this narrative. That I haven't earned my spot here because I don't have the qualifications and my spot has actually been handed to me. Once these two things are combined, these young politicians are going to be even worse at trying to help the group they are saying is the most vulnerable in this debate. But moreover, it is problematic because these young politicians now won't get the chance to even get that qualification because older politicians are fundamentally going to leave them without the chances of promoting their own campaign or being able to go to various debates because of the fact that these young politicians are certainly in the parliament already, and young older politicians rather want to get that political capital to themselves because they are at risk of not being elected. For these reasons, we've been able to see how they never actually help the young people more than they're already being helped under our side. Very happy to support.
Next speaker for their speech, now final speech of today's debate, proposition reply.
When the third speaker concedes that men have no right to deciding on women's issues because their identities are biased and skewed towards based on structural issues, he concedes that one, identity and policies are interlinked, and two, structural issues mean that certain people can't understand the life experiences of others and that they can't implement policy because of that. In the same way, the aged can't interpret different things in terms of how the youth want climate change, in terms of why socialism is so popular in the educative system, in terms of why minorities also want representation. Then they're conceding to the majority of our case. Two strategic things I want to clear out before I answer the two questions of this debate. Firstly, people don't have a big influence or a direct say in a parliamentary democracy system. We make this very clear in terms of how parties put those people in power and not them. That's incredibly damaging to their side because a lot of their argumentation is that these people will get into power even though they weren't voted for because they're tokenized, which happens already on both sides based on how parliamentary systems work. The individuals themselves are not voted for, it's the parties. That's hugely damaging to that analysis. But secondly, the whole idea of the young people haven't voted for these people and therefore it is fine also falls because the young people are trying to get young people in, but they're not succeeding because of that oligarchy that's limiting them. Second strategic thing to clear up. They try and get this really nice concession from a really smart POI where they say, if the parties are electing the people, then they'll be then they won't challenge authority and there won't be change. I responded to this, and so did Somali, by making it very explicitly clear that you can still challenge authority even if that authority put you in place. There's a vast variance in parties in terms of libertarian Tories, for example, versus authoritarian Tories. Additionally, because it's so difficult for young people to stand up, they have to choose something that criticizes that structure, especially when they're targeted on the basis of their age, especially when they're targeted because they're Jewish, for example. They have to try and attack that structure, which they often do. Main question of the debate, what is the unique inherent harm of the monopoly? Here, we're incredibly clear that this is what we want to do. This is the main aim of our policy in eradicating that monopoly on age that exists for several reasons in terms of bias, for several reasons in terms of the aggression towards the youth. They just give you a weird strategic framing to respond to this that they can get representation anyhow because old people can represent them. We didn't have to prove that young people are the best and only mechanism for representation. We just had to prove that they are the best in many instances. Don't listen to their burden when they're like, you have to prove that only young people can represent themselves. It's a proportionality mechanism. It's a mixed mechanism. That's how voting and debating in Parliament works. But additionally, to say that it's already fine, people don't want it, is absurd. They give you two examples as substitute for analysis. Alexander Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders, both of which are direct candidates that were voted for, who don't exist in a parliamentary system, completely ignoring the fact that this monopoly exists. But taking them at their best, we said that one, even when there are old people that can represent them, the voting isn't nuanced because they don't understand issues of tech, for example. But two, you don't always get those, the voting policies anyway at the point where they have prioritized certain issues because of their age and what they believe within that. At the end of this clash, it's monumentally clear that we win the debate on the basis of that unique and independent part. Second question, what are the outcomes of this policy? This was entirely secondary, and they've already lost it because they don't respond to very important things. We said that there's better youth engagement because you don't have to turn to populism when the system is including you, you don't have to hate on that system. No response, they just said it's not mutually exclusive, which was a lie. On that, they can lose the debate alone. But secondly, they just said that there are stereotypes and people don't like them. We were very clear that just because people won't like you doesn't mean that you can't succeed, and doesn't mean that we shouldn't interfere in a democratic system. If there are structural biases, we have to intervene regardless of how strong those biases are. Let's not acquiesce to the age just because they've had that monopoly for so long.